On October 13th, 1972, an Uruguayan Air Force aircraft was transporting the Old Christians team from Montevideo, Uruguay, to Santiago, Chile, where they were scheduled to play a Chilean rugby team. Before the crash, there were already challenges. The weather over Argentina, where the flight path crossed, was terrible, and the aircraft had to land overnight at an Argentine airfield. The captain informed the 45 passengers that flying directly over the Andes' tallest peaks would be impossible. Instead, the plane was to head south, following the mountain range until reaching a pass that would lead out of the dangerous area. This plan was unsuccessful. The peaks were concealed by thick, low-lying clouds, and with minimal automation in those days, flying the plane to safety became nearly impossible. As the aircraft approached the Chilean border, it passed over a remote, unexplored mountain area. There, the plane's wing struck an unnamed peak, causing it to lose its right wing. This sent the aircraft spiraling, and it lost its other wing as the mountains closed in. Subsequently, the plane plummeted and crashed into a snowbank, coming to a screeching halt. This location would later be named the Glacier of Tears. Remarkably, only 12 people died instantly in the crash. The cold climate, however, posed another threat. It quickly claimed the lives of the most seriously injured, including the sole doctor on board. With many survivors wounded, a lack of food, and no mountain gear, their survival prospects seemed bleak. Yet, they persevered. 2 survivors were medical students who used wreckage to create splints for the injured. They also salvaged materials for goggles to protect against snow blindness. The plane's disappearance had been noticed, but its white wreckage was difficult to spot against the snowbank. Unbeknownst to the survivors or rescuers, the crash site was about 21 kilometers from a former hotel and hot springs that could have offered limited shelter. The desperate survivors huddled around a salvaged radio, hoping for news. After 8 days, they heard that the search had been called off, as snow had not melted in the southern hemisphere's spring. Rather than succumb to despair, one young rugby player, Gustavo Nikolic, declared it as good news, stating, "Because we're going to get out of here on our own." However, staying alive was the immediate challenge. With dwindling food supplies, their only source of nourishment became the frozen bodies of the dead. Though horrible, this decision kept 16 survivors alive. Their numbers continued to dwindle due to the harsh conditions. And on October 29th, an avalanche killed 8 more, including Nikolic and the team's captain, Marcelo Perez. Finally, after days of being buried under snow, the survivors saw Liliana Methel, the last woman among them, die. They feared suffocation until one was able to poke a hole through the snow. Despite more misfortune, the remaining men clung to life with determination. Eventually, they decided that some of them would have to leave the wreckage and seek help. If they didn't act, there would be no chance of rescue in the remote mountains. After some deliberation, a group of the fittest and most able men were picked to strike out. Chile side of the mountains, there lay a peak so high that it seemed impassable for men without any proper mountain equipment, and the men headed east towards Argentina. There, they found the plane's tail. Inside and nearby, they found luggage containing a box of chocolates, 3 meat patties, a bottle of rum, cigarettes, extra clothes, comic books, and a little medicine. Despondent, they returned to their huddled friends at the crash site and told them that the great mountain to the west would have to be conquered if they were going to survive. The main problem with that was the nights. The mountain was too big to scale in a day, and outside the plane wreckage, the bitter cold after sundown would kill any exposed man. The only thing that the exhausted and malnourished men could do was build makeshift sleeping bags and send 3 rugby players, Roberto Canessa, Nando Parrado, and Tintin Vintinsen, out into the unknown. Later, the 3 men would describe their first night in the sleeping bags as the worst of their life, as death from exposure seemed a real possibility. When the morning dawned, however, they were all still alive and able to go on. On the 3rd day, despite almost running out of food and the perilously thin oxygen, the 3 men reached the summit of the mountain and saw the green lands beyond. They sent Vintinsen back to the wreckage by sledge to get food, before beginning to descend the great peak. 9 days into their great trek, Parrado and Canessa were below the snow line, but collapsed by a river, too exhausted to go on. Then, suddenly, the bleary-eyed Canessa spotted what looked like a man on horseback across the river. Convinced that he was hallucinating, he beckoned to Parrado, and the other man confirmed what he had thought, that they were looking at men, not 1, but 3, riding their horses on the opposite bank. Over the noise of the river, it was impossible to explain their predicament to the men, but they were just able to make out one of the horsemen promising to return the next day. They waited for 1 more night and day until the 3 men returned, threw them bread, and, even more crucially, paper and a pen. Parrado wrote what had happened, tied the paper to a rock, and hurled it across the torrent. As the news slowly leaked out to an astonished world press, Parrado got into a helicopter with a rescue team and guided them through the mist-peaked mountains back to where his friends still waited in fearful anticipation. The weather was again so bad that 2 trips on different days were needed to treat the survivors. But by the end of the 23rd of December, 1972, 16 men had been saved from seemingly impossible odds. They were treated in hospital for hypothermia and their various injuries, and all lived to tell their tales to a world that was gripped by their great tale of survival and endurance. Canessa published a new book on his experiences this year and is now a well-respected and successful pediatric cardiologist in his native Uruguay.